The History of Rome, by Titus Livius, Livy. Book 2. The Fabii and the Battle of Cremera. 41. Spurius Cassius and Proculus Virginius were next made consuls. A treaty was struck with the Hernici. 2/3 of their land were taken from them. Of this the consul Cassius was about to distribute 1/2 among the Latins, the other half among the commons. To this donation he was adding a considerable portion of land, which, though public property, he alleged was possessed by private individuals. This proceeding alarmed several of the senators, the actual possessors, at the danger of their property. The senators felt, moreover, a solicitude on public grounds, that the consul by his donation was establishing an influence dangerous to liberty. Then, for the first time, the agrarian law was proposed, which even down to our own recollection was never agitated without the greatest commotions in the state. The other consul resisted the donation, the senators seconding him, nor were all the commons opposed to him. They had at first begun to despise a gift which was extended from citizens to allies. In the next place they frequently heard the consul Virginius in the assemblies as it were prophesying that the gift of his colleague was pestilential, that those lands were sure to bring slavery to those who should receive them, that the way was paving to a throne. For why was it that the allies were included, and the Latin nation? What was the object of 1/3 of the land that had been taken being given back to the Hernici, so lately our enemies, except that instead of Coriolanus being their leader they may have Cassius? The dissuader and opposer of the agrarian law now began to be popular. Both consuls then vied with each other in humoring the commons. Virginius said that he would suffer the lands to be assigned, provided they were assigned to no one but to a Roman citizen. Cassius, because in the agrarian donation he sought popularity among the allies, and was therefore lowered in the estimation of his countrymen, in order that by another donation he might conciliate their affections, ordered that the money received for the Sicilian corn should be refunded to the people. That indeed the people rejected as nothing else than a present bribe for regal authority. So strongly were his gifts spurned in the minds of men, as if they possessed everything in abundance, in consequence of their inveterate suspicions of his aiming at sovereign power. As soon as he went out of office, it is certain that he was condemned and put to death. There are some who represent his father as the person who inflicted the punishment, that he, having tried him at home, scourged him and put him to death, and consecrated his son's private property to Ceres, that out of this a statue was set up and inscribed, given from the Cassian family. In some authors I find it stated, and that is more probable, that a day of trial was assigned him for high treason by the Questus, Caeso Fabius, and Lucius Valerus, and that he was condemned by the decision of the people, that his house was demolished by a public decree. This is the area before the temple of Tellus. But whether that trial was private or public, he was condemned in the consulship of Sergius Cornelius and Quintus Fabius. 42. The resentment of the people against Cassius was not of long duration. The allurements of the agrarian law, now that its proposer was gone, were of themselves gaining ground in their minds, and this feeling was further heightened by the parsimonious conduct of the senators, who, the Volsci and Equi having been defeated that year, defrauded the soldiers of the booty. Whatever was taken from the enemy, the consul Fabius sold, and lodged the proceeds in the treasury. The Fabian name was odious to the commons on account of the last consul. The Senate, however, succeeded in having Caeso Fabius elected consul with Lucius Aemilius. The commons, still further incensed at this, stirred up foreign war by exciting disturbance at home. Civil dissensions were then interrupted by war. The senators and commons uniting, under the conduct of Aemilius, conquered in battle the Volsci and Equi, who renewed hostilities. The retreat, however, destroyed more of the enemy than the battle, so perseveringly did the horse pursue them when routed. During the same year, on the Ides of July, the temple of Castor was dedicated. It had been vowed during the Latin war in the dictatorship of Postumius. His son, who was elected duumvir for that special purpose, dedicated it. In that year also the minds of the people were excited by the charms of the agrarian law. The tribunes of the people were for enhancing the popular power vested in them, by promoting the popular law. The senators, considering that there was enough and more than enough of frenzy in the multitude without any additional incitement, viewed with horror largesses and all inducements to temerity, the senators found in the consuls most energetic abettors in making resistance. That portion of the Commonwealth therefore prevailed, and not for the present only, but for the forthcoming year they succeeded in bringing in Marcus Fabius, Caeso's brother, as consul, and one still more detested by the commons for his persecution of Spurius Cassius, Lucius Valerus. In that year also there was a contest with the tribunes. The law proved to be a vain project, and the abettors of the law mere boasters, by their holding out a gift that was not realized. The Fabian name was from thence held in high repute, after 3 successive consulates, and all as it were uniformly exercised in contending with the tribunes. Accordingly, the honour remained for a considerable time in that family, as being right well placed. A Veientian war was then commenced. The Volscians, too, renewed hostilities, but for foreign wars their strength was almost more than sufficient, and they abused it by contending among themselves. To the distracted state of the public mind were added prodigies from heaven, exhibiting almost daily threats in the city and in the country, and the soothsayers, consulted by the state and by private individuals, one while by means of entrails, another by birds, declared that there was no other cause for the divine anger, but that the ceremonies of religion were not duly attended to. These terrors, however, terminated in this, that Oppia, a Vestal virgin, being found guilty of a breach of chastity, was made to suffer punishment. 43. Quintus Fabius and Gaius Julius were then made consuls. During this year the dissension at home was not abated, and the war abroad was more desperate. Arms were taken up by the Equins. The Veientes also entered the territory of the Romans, committing devastations, the solicitude about which wars increasing. Caeso Fabius and Spurius Fusius are created consuls. The Equi were laying siege to Ortona, a Latin city. The Veientes, now satiated with plunder, threatened that they would besiege Rome itself. Which terrors, when they ought to assuage, increased still further the bad feelings of the commons, and the custom of declining the military service was now returning, not of their own accord, but Spurius Licinius, a tribune of the people, thinking that the time was come for forcing the agrarian law on the patricians by extreme necessity, had taken on him the task of obstructing the military preparations. But all the odium of the tribunician power was turned on the author, nor did the consuls rise up against him more zealously than his own colleagues, and by their assistance the consuls hold the Livy. An army is raised for the 2 wars at the same time. One is given to Fabius to be led against the Equi, the other to Furius against the Veientians. And with respect to the Veientians, nothing was done worthy of mention. Fabius had much more trouble with his countrymen than with the enemy. That one man himself, as consul, sustained the commonwealth, which the army was betraying, far as in them lay, through their hatred of the consul. For when the consul, in addition to his other military talents, which he exhibited amply in his preparations for and conduct of war, had so drawn up his line that he routed the enemy's army solely by a charge of his cavalry, the infantry refused to pursue them when routed, and though the exhortation of their general, whom they hated, could not move them, neither could even their own infamy, and the present public disgrace and subsequent danger, if the enemy should recover courage, oblige them to quicken their pace, or even to stand in order of battle, if nothing else. Without orders they face about, and with a sorrowful air, you would suppose them beaten, they return to the camp, execrating at one time their general, at another time the services rendered by the cavalry. Nor were any remedies sought by the general for this so pestilent an example. So true is it that the most distinguished talents are more likely to be deficient in the tact of managing their countrymen than in that of conquering an enemy. The consul returned to Rome, not having so much increased his military glory as irritated and exasperated the hatred of his soldiers towards him. The patricians, however, succeeded in having the consulship remain in the Fabian family. They elect Marcus Fabius consul. Gnaeus Manlius is assigned as a colleague to Fabius. 44. This year also had a tribune as a proposer of the agrarian law. It was Titus Pontificius, he pursuing the same course, as if it had succeeded with Spurius Licinius, obstructed the Livy for a little time. The patricians being once more perplexed, Appius Claudius asserts that the tribunician power was put down last year, for the present by the very act, for the future by the precedent established, and since it was found that it could be rendered ineffective by its own strength, for that there never would be wanting a tribune who would both be willing to obtain a victory for himself over his colleague, and the favour of the better party by advancing the public weal. That both a plurality of tribunes, if there were need of such plurality, would be ready to assist the consuls, and that even one would be sufficient against all. Only let the consuls and leading members of the Senate take care to gain over, if not all, at least some of the tribunes, to the Commonwealth and the Senate. The senators, convinced by the counsels of Appius, both collectively addressed the tribunes with kindness and civility, and the men of consular rank, according as each possessed personal influence over them individually, partly by conciliation, partly by authority, prevailed so far as to make them consent that the powers of the tribunician office should be beneficial to the state, and by the aid of 4 tribunes against one obstructor of the public good, the consuls complete the Livy. They then set out to the Veientian War, to which auxiliaries had flocked from all parts of Etruria, collected not so much for the sake of the Veientians, as because they had formed a hope that the Roman state might be destroyed by internal discord. And in the councils of all the states of Etruria the leading men openly stated that the Roman power was eternal, unless they were distracted by disturbances among themselves. That this was the only poison, this the bane discovered for powerful states, to render great empires mortal. That this evil, a long time retarded, partly by the wise measures of the patricians, partly by the forbearance of the commons, had now proceeded to extremities. That 2 states were now formed out of one, that each party had its own magistrates, its own laws. That though at first they were accustomed to be turbulent during the levies, still that these same individuals had ever been obedient to their commanders during war, that military discipline being still retained, no matter what might be the state of the city, it had been possible to withstand the evil, that now the custom of not obeying their superior followed the Roman soldier even to the camp. That in the last war in the very field, in the very heat of battle, by consent of the army the victory was voluntarily surrendered to the vanquished equi, that the standards were deserted, the general abandoned on the field, and that the army had returned to the camp without orders. That without doubt, if perseverance were used, Rome might be conquered by her own soldiery. That nothing else was necessary than to declare and make a show of war, that the fates and the gods would of themselves manage the rest. These hopes had armed the Etrurians, who in many vicissitudes had been vanquished and victors. 45. The Roman consuls also dreaded nothing else than their own strength and their own arms. The recollection of the destructive precedents set in the last war deterred them from bringing matters to such a pass as that they should have to fear 2 armies at the same time. Accordingly they kept within their camp, avoiding this double danger, that delay and time itself would soften down resentment and bring a right way of thinking to their minds. The Veientian enemy and the Etrurians proceeded with so much the greater precipitation. They provoked them to battle, first riding up to the camp and challenging them. At length, when they produced no effect by reviling as well the consuls themselves as the army, they stated that the pretence of internal dissension was assumed as a cloak for this cowardice, and that the consuls distrusted as much the courage as the obedience of their soldiers. That silence and inaction among men in arms were a novel form of sedition. Besides this they threw out reproaches, both true as well as false, on the upstart quality of their race and origin. Whilst they vociferated these reproaches beneath the very rampart and gates, the consuls bore them without impatience, but at one time indignation, at another time shame, distracted the breasts of the ignorant multitude, and diverted their attention from intestine evils. They were unwilling that the enemy should come off unpunished. They were unwilling that success should accrue to the patricians or the consuls. Foreign and domestic hatred struggled for mastery in their breasts. At length the former prevail, so haughtily and insolently did the enemy revile them. They crowd in a body to the general's tent. They demand battle. They require that the signal be given. The consuls confer together as if to deliberate. They continue the conference for a long time. They were desirous of fighting, but that desire must be checked and concealed, that by opposition and delay they might increase the ardour of the soldiery once roused. An answer is returned, that the matter in question was premature, that it was not yet time for fighting, that they should keep within their camp. They then issue a proclamation that they should abstain from fighting, that if any one fought without orders, they should punish him as an enemy. When they were thus dismissed, Their eagerness for fighting increases in proportion as they think that the consuls were less disposed for it. The enemies, moreover, come up much more insolently, as soon as it was known that the consuls had determined not to fight. For they supposed that they might insult them with impunity, that their arms were not entrusted to the soldiery, that the matter would explode in a violent mutiny, that a termination had come to the Roman Empire. Relying on these hopes, they run up to the gates, heap reproaches on them, with difficulty refrain from assaulting the camp. Now indeed the Romans could no longer endure these insults. They crowd from every quarter of the camp to the consuls. They no longer, as formerly, make their demand with reserve, through the mediation of the centurions of the first rank, but all proceed indiscriminately with loud clamours. The affair was now ripe, still they put it off. Fabius then, his colleague giving way in consequence of his dread of mutiny being now augmented by the uproar, after he had commanded silence by sound of trumpet, says, that these men are able to conquer, Gnaeus Manlius, I know, that they are willing they themselves have prevented me from knowing. It is therefore resolved and determined not to give the signal, unless they swear that they will return victorious from this battle. The soldier has once deceived the Roman consul in the field, the gods he never will deceive. There was a centurion, Marcus Flavillaeus, one of the foremost in demanding battle. He says, Marcus Fabius, I will return victorious from the field. If he deceived, he invokes the anger of Father Jove, Mars Gradivus, and of the other gods. After him the entire army severally take the same oath. The signal is given to them when sworn. They take up arms, go into battle, full of rage and of hope. They bid the Etrurians now to cast their reproaches. They severally require that the enemy, once so ready with the tongue, should now stand before them armed as they were. On that day the bravery of all, both commons and patricians, was extraordinary. The Fabian name, the Fabian race shone forth most conspicuous. They are determined to recover in that battle the affections of the commons, which during many civil contests had been alienated from them. The line of battle is formed, nor do the Veientian foe and the Etrurian legions decline the contest. 46. An almost certain hope was entertained that they would no more fight with them than they had done with the Equi, that even some more serious attempt was not to be despaired of, considering the irritated state of their feelings and the very critical occasion. The affair turned out altogether differently, for never before in any other war did the Roman soldiers enter the field with more determined minds, so much had the enemy exasperated them by taunts on the one hand, and the consuls by delay on the other. The Etrurians had scarcely time to form their ranks, when the javelins having been thrown away at random, in the first hurry, rather than discharged with aim, the battle had now come to close fighting, even to swords, where the fury of war is most desperate. Among the foremost, the Fabian family was distinguished for the sight it afforded and the example it presented to their fellow citizens. One of these, Quintus Fabius, he had been consul 2 years before, as he was advancing at the head of his men against a dense body of Veientians, and whilst engaged amid numerous parties of the enemy, and therefore not prepared for it, was transfixed with a sword through the breast by a Tuscan who presumed on his bodily strength and skill in arms. On the weapon being extracted, Fabius fell forward on the wound. Both armies felt the fall of this one man, and the Roman began in consequence to give way, when the consul Marcus Fabius leaped over the body as it lay, and holding up his buckler, said, Is this what you swore, soldiers, that you would return to the camp in flight? Are you thus more afraid of your most dastardly enemies than of Jupiter and Mars, by whom you have sworn? But I who have not sworn will either return victorious, or will fall fighting here beside thee, Quintus Fabius. Then Caeso Fabius, the consul of the preceding year, says to the consul, Brother, is it by these words you think you will prevail on them to fight? The gods by whom they have sworn will prevail on them. Let us also, as men of noble birth, as is worthy of the Fabian name, enkindle the courage of the soldiers by fighting rather than by exhorting. Thus the two Fabii rushed forward to the front with presented spears, and brought on with them the whole line. 47. The battle being restored on one side, Gnaeus Manlius, the consul, with no less ardour, encouraged the fight on the other wing, where an almost similar result took place, for as the soldiers undauntedly followed Quintus Fabius on the one wing, So did they follow Manlius on this, as he was driving the enemy now nearly routed, and when he, having received a severe wound, retired from the battle, they fell back, supposing that he was slain, and would have given way, had not the other consul, galloping at full speed to that quarter with some troops of horse, supported their drooping energies, crying out that his colleague was still alive, that he himself was now come victorious, having routed the other wing. Manlius also shows himself to restore the battle. The well-known voices of the two consuls rekindle the courage of the soldiers. At the same time, too, the enemy's line was now weakened, whilst, relying on their superior numbers, they draw off their reserve and send them to storm the camp. This being assaulted without much resistance, whilst they lose time in attending to plunder rather than to fighting, the Roman triarii, 96, who had not been able to sustain the first shock, having sent an account to the consuls of the present position of affairs, return in a compact body to the praetorium, and of themselves renew the battle. The consul Manlius, also having returned to the camp, and posted soldiers at all the gates, had blocked up every passage against the enemy. This desperate situation aroused the fury rather than the bravery of the Etrurians, for when rushing on wherever hope held out the prospect of escape, they had frequently advanced with fruitless efforts. One body of young men makes an attack on the consul himself, conspicuous from his arms. The first weapons were intercepted by those who stood around him. Afterwards their force could not be sustained. The consul falls, having received a mortal wound, and all around him are dispersed. The courage of the Etrurians rises. Terror drives the Romans in dismay through the entire camp, and matters would have come to extremities, had not the lieutenant generals, hastily seizing the body of the consul, opened a passage for the enemy at one gate. Through this they rush out, and going away in the utmost disorder, they fall in with the other consul who had been victorious. There again they are slain and routed in every direction. A glorious victory was obtained, saddened however by two so illustrious deaths. The consul, therefore, on the Senate voting him a triumph, replied, that if the army could triumph without their general, he would readily accede to it in consideration of their distinguished behavior in that war, that for his own part, his family being plunged in grief in consequence of the death of his brother Quintus Fabius, and the Commonwealth being in some degree bereaved by the loss of one of her consuls, he would not accept the laurel blasted by public and private grief. The triumph thus resigned was more distinguished than any triumph actually enjoyed. So true it is, that glory refused in due season sometimes returns with accumulated lustre. He next celebrates the two funerals of his colleague and brother, one after the other, he himself acting as panegyrist in the case of both, when by ascribing to them his own deserts, he himself obtained the greatest share of them. And not unmindful of that which he had conceived at the commencement of his consulate, namely, the regaining the affection of the people, he distributes the wounded soldiers among the patricians to be cured. Most of them were given to the Fabii, nor were they treated with greater attention in any other place. From this time the Fabii began to be popular, and that not by any practices except such as were beneficial to the state. 48. Accordingly Caeso Fabius, having been elected consul with Titus Virginius not more with the zealous wishes of the senators than of the commons, attended neither to wars, nor levies, nor any other object, until the hope of concord being now in some measure commenced, the feelings of the commons might be consolidated with those of the senators as soon as possible. Wherefore at the commencement of the year he proposed, that before any tribune should stand forth as an abettor of the agrarian law, the patricians themselves should be beforehand with them in performing their duty, that they should distribute among the commons the land taken from the enemy in as equal a proportion as possible, that it was but just that those should obtain it, by whose blood and sweat it was obtained. The patricians rejected the proposal with scorn. Some even complained that the once brilliant talents of Caeso were now becoming wanton, and were waning through excess of glory. There were afterwards no factions in the city. The Latins were harassed by the incursions of the Equi. Caeso, being sent thither with an army, passes into the very territory of the Equi to depopulate it. The Equi retired into the towns, and kept themselves within the walls. On that account no battle worth mentioning was fought. But a blow was received from the Veientian foe through the temerity of the other consul, and the army would have been all cut off, had not Caeso Fabius come to their assistance in time. From that time there was neither peace nor war with the Veientians. Their proceedings had now come very near to the form of that of brigands. They retired from the Roman troops into the city. When they perceived that the troops were drawn off, they made incursions into the country, alternately evading war by quiet by war. Thus the matter could neither be dropped altogether, nor brought to a conclusion, and other wars were impending either at the moment, as from the Equi and Volsci, who remained inactive no longer than until the recent smart of their late disaster should pass away, or it was evident that the Sabines, ever hostile, and all Etruria would put themselves in motion, but the Veientians, a constant rather than a formidable enemy, kept their minds in constant uneasiness by their insults more frequently than by any danger apprehended from them, a matter which could at no time be neglected, and which suffered them not to direct their attention to any other object. Then the Fabian family addressed the Senate. The consul speaks in the name of the family. Conscript fathers, the Veientian war requires, as you know, a constant rather than a strong force. Do you attend to other wars? Assign the Fabii as enemies to the Veientians. We pledge ourselves that the majesty of the Roman name shall be safe in that quarter. That war, as the property of our family, it is our determination to conduct at our own private expense. Let the Republic be spared the expense of soldiers and money there. The warmest thanks were returned to them. The consul, leaving the Senate house, accompanied by the Fabii in a body, who had been standing in the porch of the Senate house, returned home. Being ordered to attend on the following day in arms at the consul's gate, they retire to their homes. 49. The rumour spreads through the entire city. They extol the Fabii to the skies by their encomiums. That a single family had taken on them the burden of the state, that the Veientian war had now become a private concern, a private quarrel. If there were two families of the same strength in the city, let them demand, the one the Volsci for itself, the other the Equi, that all the neighbouring states might be subdued, the Roman people all the time enjoying profound peace. The day following, the Fabii take up arms. They assemble where they had been ordered. The consul coming forth in his paludamentum beholds his entire family in the porch drawn up in order of march. Being received into the centre, he orders the standards to be carried forward. Never did an army march through the city, either smaller in number, or more distinguished in fame and in the admiration of all men. 306 soldiers, all patricians, all of the one stock, not one of whom the Senate would reject as a leader in its palmiest days, proceeded on their march, menacing destruction to the Veientian state by the prowess of a single family. A crowd followed, partly belonging to their kinsmen and friends, who contemplated in mind no moderation either as to their hopes or anxiety, but everything on the highest scale, partly consisting of individuals not connected with their family, aroused by solicitude for the public weal, all enraptured with esteem and admiration. They bid them proceed in the brave resolve, proceed with happy omens, bring back results proportioned to their undertaking, thence to expect consulships and triumphs, all rewards, all honours from them. As they pass the Capitol and the citadel, and the other sacred edifices, they offer up prayers to all the gods that presented themselves to their sight, or to their mind, that they would send forward that band with prosperity and success, and soon send them back safe into their country to their parents. In vain were these prayers sent up. Having set out on their luckless road by the right-hand postern of the Carmental Gate, they arrive at the river Cremera. This appeared a favourable situation for fortifying a post. Lucius Aemilius and Gaius Servilius were then created consuls. And as long as there was nothing else to occupy them but mutual devastations, the Fabii were not only sufficiently able to protect their garrison, but through the entire tract, as far as the Etrurian joins the Roman territory, they protected all their own districts and ravaged those of the enemy, spreading their forces along both frontiers. There was afterwards an intermission, though not of long duration, to these depredations, whilst both the Veientians, having sent for an army from Etruria, assault the post at the Cremera, and the Roman troops, led thither by L. Aemilius the consul, come to a close engagement in the field with the Etrurians, although the Veientians had scarcely time to draw up their line, for during the first alarm, whilst the ranks are posting themselves behind their respective banners and they are stationing their reserves, a brigade of Roman cavalry charging them suddenly in flank, took away all opportunity not only of commencing the fight, but even of standing their ground. Thus being driven back to the Red Rocks, there they pitched their camp, they suppliantly sue for peace, for the obtaining of which they were sorry, from the natural inconsistency of their minds, before the Roman garrison was drawn off from the Cremera. 50. Again the Veientian state had to contend with the Fabii without any additional military armament on either side, and there were not merely incursions into each other's territories, or sudden attacks on those making the incursions, but they fought repeatedly in the open field, and in pitched battles, and one family of the Roman people oftentimes gained the victory over an entire Etrurian state, one of the most powerful at that time. This at first appeared mortifying and humiliating to the Veientians. Then they formed a design, suggested by the circumstance, of surprising their daring enemy by an ambuscade. They were even glad that the confidence of the Fabii was increasing by their great success. Wherefore cattle were frequently driven in the way of the plundering parties, as if they had come there by mere accident, and tracts of land were abandoned by the flight of the peasants, and troops of armed men sent to prevent the devastations retreated more frequently from pretended than from real fear. And now the Fabii had such a contempt for the enemy, as to believe that their invincible arms could not be withstood either in any place or on any occasion. This presumption carried them so far, that at the sight of some cattle at a distance from Cremera, with an extensive plain lying between, they ran down to it, although few troops of the enemy were observed. And when incautious and in disorderly haste they had passed the ambuscade placed on either side of the very road, and when dispersed in different directions, they began to carry off the cattle straying about. As is usual when they are frightened, the Veientians rise up suddenly from their ambuscade, and the enemy were in front and on every side. At first the shout that was raised terrified them, then weapons assailed them from every side, and, the Etrurians closing, they also were compelled, hemmed in as they now were by a compact body of soldiers, to contract their own circle within a narrower compass, which circumstance rendered striking both their own paucity of numbers and the superior numbers of the enemy, the ranks being crowded in a narrow space. Then the plan of fighting, which they had directed equally against every part, being now relinquished, they all inclined their forces towards one point. In that direction, straining every effort both with their bodies and arms, they forced a passage by forming a wedge. The way led to a hill of moderate acclivity. Here they first halted. Presently, as soon as the higher ground afforded them time to gain breath, and to recover from so great a panic, they repulsed them as they advanced up, and the small band by the advantage of the ground was gaining the victory, had not a party of the Veientians, sent round the ridge of the hill, made their way to the summit. Thus again the enemy obtained the higher ground. All the Fabii were killed to a man, and the fort was taken. It is agreed on all hands that the 306 were cut off, that one only, who nearly attained the age of puberty, was left as a stock for the Fabian race, and that he was destined to prove the greatest support in the dangerous emergencies of the Roman people both at home and in war. 51. At the time when this disaster was received, Gaius Horatius and Titus Maninius were consuls. Maninius was immediately sent against the Etrurians, elated with victory. Then too an unsuccessful battle was fought, and the enemy took possession of the Janiculum, and the city would have been besieged, scarcity of provisions bearing hard upon them in addition to the war, for the Etrurians had passed the Tiber, had not the consul Horatius been recalled from the Volsae, and so closely did that war approach the very walls, that the first battle was fought near the Temple of Hope with doubtful success, and a second time at the Colline Gate. There, although the Romans had the advantage in a slight degree only, yet that contest rendered the soldiers better for future battles by restoring to them their former courage. Aulus Virginius and Spurius Servilius are created consuls. After the defeat sustained in the last battle, the Veientians declined an engagement. Ravages were committed, and they made incursions in every direction on the Roman territory from the Janiculum as if from a fortress. Nowhere were the cattle or the husbandmen safe. They were afterwards entrapped by the same stratagem as that by which they had entrapped the Fabii. Having pursued some cattle that had been driven on designedly for the purpose of decoying them, they fell into an ambuscade. In proportion as they were more numerous, the slaughter was greater. The violent resentment resulting from this disaster was the cause and commencement of one still greater. For having crossed the Tiber by night, they attempted to assault the camp of the consul Servilius. Being repulsed from thence with great slaughter, they with difficulty made good their retreat into the Janiculum. The consul himself also crosses the Tiber, fortifies his camp at the foot of the Janiculum, at break of day on the following morning, both from being somewhat elated by the success of the battle of the day before, more however because the scarcity of corn forced him into measures which, though dangerous, he adopted. Because they were more expeditious, he rashly marched his army up the steep of the Janiculum to the camp of the enemy, and being repulsed from thence with more disgrace than he had repulsed them on the preceding day, he was saved, both himself and his army, by the intervention of his colleague. The Etrurians, hemmed in between the two armies, when they presented their rear to the one and the other by turns, were entirely cut off. Thus the Veientian War was crushed by a fortunate act of temerity. 52. Together with the peace, provisions returned to the city in greater abundance, both by reason of corn having been brought in from Campania, and, as soon as the fear felt by each of future famine left them, that corn being brought forward which had been hoarded up. Then their minds once more became licentious from their present abundance and ease, and their former subjects of complaint, now that there were none abroad, they sought for at home. The tribunes began to excite the commons by their poison, the agrarian law. They roused them against the senators who opposed it, and not only against them as a body, but also against particular individuals. Quintus Considius and Titus Genutius, the proposers of the agrarian law, appoint a day of trial for Titus Menenius. The loss of the fort of Cremera, whilst the consul had his standing camp at no great distance from thence, was the charge against him. They crushed him, though both the senators had exerted themselves in his behalf with no less earnestness than in behalf of Coriolanus, and the popularity of his father Agrippa was not yet forgotten. The tribunes, however, went no further than a fine. Though they had arraigned him for a capital offence, they imposed on him, when found guilty, a fine of 2,000 asses. This proved fatal. They say that he could not submit to the disgrace, and to the anguish of mind, occasioned by it that, in consequence, he was taken off by disease. Another senator, Spurius Servilius, being soon after arraigned, as soon as he went out of office, a day of trial having been appointed for him by the tribunes, Lucius Caedicius and Titus Statius, at the very commencement of the year, in the consulship of Gaius Nortius and Publius Valerus, did not, like Menenius, meet the attacks of the tribunes with supplications from himself and the patricians, but with firm reliance on his own integrity and his personal influence. The battle with the Etrurians at the Janiculum was the charge against him also, but being a man of an intrepid spirit, as he had formerly acted in the case of public peril, so now in that which was personal to himself, he dispelled the danger by boldly facing it, by confuting not only the tribunes but the commons also, by a bold speech, and upbraiding them with the condemnation and death of Titus Menenius, by the good offices of whose father the commons were formally re-established, and were now in possession of those laws and those magistrates, by means of which they then exercised their insolence. His colleague Virginius also, who was brought forward as a witness, aided him by assigning to him a share of his own deserts. The condemnation of Menenius, however, was of greater service to him, so much had they changed their minds. Classics in Audiobook is dedicated to promoting free learning about the ancient world. If you have enjoyed this audiobook, please consider supporting the channel in one or more of the following ways.